Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah for khair for joining us this Sunday and spending this Sunday with us. My name is Naveed Mustafa. I'm the principal at Al Falah School. Um, like most of us, we may have our separate designation at our work, at our day job, but I think we all agree that one of the important designations that we all can have is being the parent. Uh, the lasting impact that we all aspire is to have for our kids to have a lasting impact in our community, which in the sense become so the investment that we can make today, so that our future kids become more of a ring bearer and leaders of our community in the society, inshallah ta'ala. We all know we're living in a information boom era, and on one hand, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, we are all lucky, mashallah, that we have information at our fingertips. We can get anything that we want to get. But on the other hand, for our kids, they also have all information at their fingertips as well. The good, the bad, the ugly. And that's we are, as a parent, that's one of the main challenges that we all have. The greatest is to navigate through this sophisticated information era and how to not only protect our kids from the fitna that lurks, but also groom them to be more strong, more contributing, and most importantly, more faithful community members of our society. So with that spirit, mashallah, we're delighted to, very delighted to start this monthly workshop series where we will be aiming to educate ourselves on the parenting skills of this modern age, which is grounded on the principles of core principles of Islam. And we cannot be more excited and delighted and humbled to have Sister Dr. Suzy Ismail to be leading this, kicking this one off. Dr. Suzy Ismail is a renowned speaker. She's a founder of Cornerstone, which is basically a nonprofit faith-based organization primarily focusing on relationship, wellness, and rehabilitation. Dr. Suzy, inshallah, next week will also be hosting another session for our kids for 12 and above at the same place between 11 to 12:30, where the topic, inshallah, is going to be feelings and actions driven by emotions, how to use faith as a compass. And for this entire workshop series, mashallah, we have excellent speakers lined up for next month. In January, we will have Ustad Yusuf Jabir, who's going to be talking about social media. And then, inshallah, in February, we will have chaplain of Rutgers, Kaisar Aslam, joining us. And then, inshallah, following month, which is in March, we will have Dalia Fahmy coming us, which is, if you all know, is the sister of Sheikh Yasir Fahmy. So, inshallah, in a few weeks, we will also conduct a survey. We want to hear from you if there is any specific topics that you want to bring up that we would like, that we should host. We want to have these sessions as interactive as possible so that we all can learn from each other and our experience, different experiences that we have. I also want to thank our extended school team that actually worked tirelessly to set up and then have this event possible. I truly appreciate it. One last announcement that I want to make: the lunch is going to be available for purchase today, inshallah, and all the money is going to be used for compensating his school expenses. So Jazakallah again for coming in. I hope that these series will be beneficial to all of us, inshallah ta'ala. And without further ado, I present you Dr. Suzy Ismail.
جزاك الله خير. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم everyone. So mashallah, this is a beautiful masjid. This is my first time here in the center. I've been hearing a lot about this masjid, so it's such an honor and a blessing to be able to join you. May Allah Azza wa Jal protect this community and protect the organizers and the founders of this space. I know that it was not an easy journey to develop this space. I used to hear and read snippets here and there. So mashallah, it's beautiful, and I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal allows it to be a space that generations to come are proud to call their space, where it feels like a space of belonging and connection to them. So today's topic, the topic of tarbiyah, is definitely one of my favorite topics because oftentimes, we address the issues of our youth at the point where they have reached the teenage years or the young adult years. And so many times in those years, we question what's wrong, how did this happen, right? And we often will find ourselves looking at the problem and identifying the problem as the individual, the youth, himself or herself being the problem. And we know that that's not the case. We know that children throughout the stages of tarbiyah really address their emotions, address their environment, address what it is that they're responding to in different ways. And what we see, for example, in our counseling centers in the ages of 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 is not something that just happened overnight. But the problems and difficulties that we see our youth facing in terms of identity, in terms of loss of faith, in terms of loneliness, in terms of mental health struggles, began way before we actually get to see them. And this is what we really want to talk about today. How do we start the journey of tarbiyah, and how do we work through all of the stages of tarbiyah to hopefully raise our children in a way that is most pleasing to Allah and to guide them to walk in the footsteps of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Oftentimes when we talk about the stages of tarbiyah, the first question that I will get in the Q&A is, what if it's too late? What if I didn't do what we talked about in stage 1? What if I didn't do what we talked about in stage 2? And honestly, brothers and sisters, alhamdulillah, it is never too late. And this is such an important component of our deen, understanding that even if we're talking about the first stage, age 0 to 7, and you're like, oh, my kids are not in that stage anymore, we can still learn and apply what we take from the first stage into the second stage or the third stage. So we're going to journey together into each of those stages and try to better understand what we see from both a spiritual and a psycho-socio-emotional relational lens. And I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but our approach at Cornerstone to mental wellness and emotional wellness really focuses on the holistic being, not just focusing on what's happening here, but also what's happening here in the heart, what's happening in the relationships externally, what's happening internally and externally. And that's what we're going to dive into today. So bismillah. When we talk about the first stage of tarbiyah, we see that it exists in a series of 7 essentially, right? And this is following the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We know that the process of tarbiyah is broken into 3 chapters essentially. The first segment of tarbiyah is from age 0 to 7. The second segment is from 8 to 14, and the third segment is from 15 to 21. So in that first stage from 0 to 7, oftentimes when we look at child development books and from a Western psychological standpoint, we see that the Western perspective of psychology is that the development of the child begins at birth. But from the Islamic perspective, we recognize that the development of the child begins before birth. What does that mean? When we look to the Quran, we see in the example of Maryam alayha salam, we see in the Quran the mother of Maryam alayha salam, the wife of Imran, in Surah Al-Imran, speaking of what is in her womb. When she is expecting a child that she made sincere dua for, she turns to Allah Azza wa Jal prior to the birth of her child, and she states that she has dedicated what is in her womb to the service of Allah. Here we see the importance of intention. What is our niyyah when we have our children? So often when we look at our intentions in this dunya, it may be intentions that are somewhat self-serving. And this is the way human nature has been created. This is why Allah Azza wa Jal speaks to us of the journey of tazkiyat al-nafs in terms of quelching the ego and stepping on the desires that are only serving us in this dunya. So it starts with the intention. When we have our children, is the intention to have children to fill a gap in our life? Is the intention to have children to fix a broken marriage? Is the intention to have children to get a mother-in-law off your back or a father-in-law off your back? Is the intention to have children because it's what society expects? Or is the intention to have children an intention that mirrors the intention that the mother of Maryam alayhi salam had, which was to dedicate our children to the service of Allah? It's a very selfless intention, but it's an intention that we can renew day in and day out. So it's not an intention that's one and done, that if we didn't make this intention when the child was still in the womb, then that's it. Every day that we raise our children, regardless of what stage or what age they are at, we must renew our intention. And to renew our intention, we must remind ourselves of what Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us of in Surah Al-Kahf. Al-mal wal-banun zinatul hayat ad-dunya. Our wealth and our children are but an adornment in this life. They may beautify our life, but they may also test us in this life. And they are entrusted to us from Allah. So really clarifying your intention is the first step. And we see, of course, in the example in the Quran, when the mother of Maryam alayhi salam dedicates what is in her womb to the service of Allah, she does so thinking at that time, and for all of us who are mothers or who have experienced pregnancy, sometimes you kind of make a guess as to the gender of the child that you are carrying. And we see that in the example in the Quran, the mother of Maryam, based on the social status of that time, made the assumption that what she was carrying was a male, because at that time it was only the males who would be accepted in terms of theological studies, in terms of being able to excel as scholars in the monotheistic faith. And so when she delivers Maryam alayhi salam, the mother of Maryam, the wife of Imran, says a statement that is recorded in the Quran, and she says that she has given birth to a female, and the female is not like the male. And Allah Azza wa Jal gives us the response in the Quran by saying that He accepted her onto His service. Now, so often when we work with teens, and particularly teens who are currently struggling with what may be labeled as gender dysphoria, but is in reality social dysphoria, so the female teenager who decides that she is a male or identifies as a male, or that she is non-binary, or that she is non-conformist. We're going to talk a little bit more about what those mean in the coming stages. But so many times we will see that this female who might make this statement, when we dig and try to better understand why she wants to change her gender, why she doesn't want to identify as a female, we see that it is in reality social dysphoria. And she will say things like, in my home, my parents always say that the girl is not like the boy. And that means my brothers get to stay out until midnight and I have to be home before Maghrib. That means that my brothers wear whatever they want and do whatever they want, and I have all these restrictions. That means that my father is essentially the dictator in the household and my mother has no say. And so often we see this verse in the Quran, the statement that the mother of Maryam alayhi salam makes that the female is not like the male, unfortunately being used in our households in ways that cause our young females, that cause our girls to feel a sense of oppression. And yet contextually, when we understand this verse in the Quran, we understand that the mother of Maryam alayhi salam is making this statement to clarify that in that societal time, women were not often accepted into the service of Allah. And yet Allah Azza wa Jal states that He accepted her into His service. And we know that Maryam alayhi salam was one of the chosen women, one of the 4 chosen women promised Jannah, and a woman who was raised in the mihrab, the most sacred part of the temple, raised studying the monotheistic faith, raised with her uncle as her guardian, Zakaria alayhi salam, who was also a prophet. So, first of all, recognizing the intentionality of giving birth. The intention is that purification, that sense of connection with Allah, and recognizing the amana or the trust that exists in the child. Secondly, understanding from the moment of birth that biologically there are, of course, differences in the way that Allah Azza wa Jal has created male and female. Sociologically, there are differences that do not align with our deen, and many of those differences are cultural, meaning restrictions that are often placed on our females, and many of those restrictions may be coming from a place of hayat, but unfortunately we may not place similar guidelines or boundaries or restrictions on our male children. So being conscious of this from the get-go. So this is stage 0, right? Before the child is even born, setting the groundwork. Also understanding who we are, because our children are going to carry with them both that aspect of nature and nurture. So they will carry with them parts of who we are, and they will emulate other parts of who we are. So really the tarbiyah of the child begins before the child is even a thought in our minds. The tarbiyah of the child begins with how we work on ourselves, how we carry ourselves, our connection with Allah Azza wa Jal, and the journey that we are taking in terms of self-improvement. Now the child is born, right? The child has made their appearance. We know in those early stages, right? This is the stage where the mother is, most of the time, the primary caregiver. And this is the way Allah Azza wa Jal has created us. That regardless of what science says today, we know that only the female can give biological birth. That only the female can provide the aspect of nursing. And in those early stages in which the child is forming those bonds and those connections, the male impact, the impact of the father, is just as important. That just as the mother is there biologically, maybe caring for the child, the father's emotional impact and how... Is this one better? This one has a bit of an echo. Yes. Okay, yes, there's no echo in this one, alhamdulillah. You can hear me better now? Perfect, alhamdulillah. So just as the mother, plays a role, we cannot, limit or deny the role of the father. And again, we have the best of examples in the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in his connection with his daughters and the role that he played in raising his girls as well. So during those early days, age 0 to 7, this is where we understand that the child is like the master. So what does it mean the child is like the master? In the beginning of the talk, when we had just started, there was a young little girl, I don't think she's here anymore, but probably within that first stage, age 0 to 7. And, she was playing with the little folding divider here. And, immediately we kind of went up and said, no, don't play with that, right? But it was said gently, it was said kindly, right? And there were like smiles, like, oh, she's so cute, mashallah, right? Someone walks around with a stroller or like a car seat, everybody's peeking in, and it's like, oh, so cute. In this stage, age 0 to 7, our children often not only win our hearts, but they win the hearts of others as well. And I feel like this is the way Allah Azza wa Jal creates children in that early stage, so that we can remember how much we love them or how close we are during those middle school and high school years where we need reminding sometimes. So subhanAllah, at that stage, the child often feels the greatest sense of security, the greatest sense of affirmation. Sometimes it's not necessarily from the home, and if they don't get it from the home, they may be getting it from the community, from externally. But we're going to talk about why it's so important that that sense of affirmation and validation comes from within the home. During this stage, we often see the seat of attachment. And some of you may be familiar with the attachment theory, which oftentimes, if you have difficulty later on in your relationship, let's say a marital relationship, and many of you know that we deal with a lot of marital situations at Cornerstone. Let's say there's a marital situation in which, maybe when there is an argument or a disagreement, the husband shuts down or stonewalls and doesn't want to talk anymore. And the wife maybe is like, I want to talk about this. Don't go to sleep. You can't go to sleep until we're done talking about this. Talk to me now, right? Or maybe, it's a texting situation where a husband or maybe a wife sends like one text and says, see you later. And the husband is like, no, where are you? When are you coming home? Why are you not home yet, right? What we see in these communicative responses is not something that develops in the marriage. It's actually something that develops in that early stage of tarbiyah, which is your sense of attachment. The one who stonewalls, the one who shuts down, the one who disengages or is unable to talk about whatever difficulties or confrontation maybe needs to be addressed is often classified as having an avoidant or a dismissive attachment style. The one who responds with agitation, with high elevated emotion, who wants to resolve the issue immediately, who has this sense of urgency in everything, often is classified as having anxious attachment. Both of these attachment styles, and there are a few others, but both of these attachment styles develop in that early stage. If you as a parent turn away from the bids of your children, if your child tries to connect with you and you do not give them that opportunity for connection, you will find them gravitating in older years to either anxious attachment or avoidant. Either they will replicate your way of disconnecting by avoiding, or they will grow anxious in terms of wanting to connect, desiring to connect, and it will carry over into the marital relationship as well. So what we're doing in this first stage of tarbiyah is not just, teaching our children their 1, 2, 3s and their Quran and their Arabi. We are actually preparing them for who they are going to be and how they are going to be in their own family relationships. We are preparing them for how they will even parent, inshallah, if and when they become parents. So how do we do it? How do we guide them during that stage in a way that can be most effective from the spiritual, psycho-socio-emotional, relational wellness view? So first of all, I want you guys to do a little exercise with me. So I'm going to have you all stand up for a minute. I know you've been sitting for a bit now, so we'll stand up. So everybody stand up. Right. And I want you all to raise up your right hand. I'm not going to make you take bay'ah or anything, just raise up your right hand. I want you all to touch your head. I want you all to now touch your shoulder. I want you to touch your knee. Now I want you all to touch your chin. Okay. How many of you touched your cheek instead of your chin? Okay. All right, sit down, everyone, sit down. All right. Those of you who touched your cheek, did you hear me say chin? Why did you touch your cheek then? Because I did it, right? Because you saw me do this. Now, as adults, we tend to develop further our verbal skills, right? Where we become more oral or auditory in terms of how we respond. As children, the strongest indicator of contextualization or understanding the world comes from the visual. And yet so many times for our children, we will say something to them, but we may model a different type of behavior. And then we don't understand why they're not listening. So for example, the child who we say to the child, don't call your sister names. And yet, in our household, we may be calling our spouse names. Don't fight with your sister, don't argue. And yet we may be modeling arguments for our children. The child who we say to them, don't lie, it's haram. And yet, when we're home with the child, maybe the phone rings, and maybe it's our mother-in-law, and the child answers the phone, and we say, tell her I'm not here. Tell her I'm busy right now. I'm in the shower. And we guide our children to these types of behaviors, right? And despite us saying, don't lie, it's haram, if what they are viewing, what they are visually seeing and experiencing goes against our words, what are they going to believe? They're going to believe what they see. If we as adults in that simple exercise we just did got thrown off a little bit when you saw me put my hand on my cheek, even though I said chin, imagine our children. Imagine the contradictory messages that our children are receiving at this stage. This is the stage of role modeling. This is the stage in which our children, our daughters, maybe they will put on a hijab and say, I want to be like mama. Maybe they will open up a laptop and say, I want to be like mama, or I want to be like baba. Maybe they will carry a briefcase and head out and say, I want to be like baba, I want to be like mama. This is the stage where they will emulate us, and it's a very short period of time. Because in stage 2, they no longer want to be like mama and baba. They want to be like Beyonce and I don't know, Tupac or whoever's popular these days, So we have a very small window in terms of being able to role model that positive behavior. So how did the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam model that behavior? We see that the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam with Fatima radiallahu anha, during that early stage of tarbiyah, when he would enter a room and Fatima radiallahu anha would be seated, he would go directly to her and kiss her on the forehead. If the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam was seated in a room and Fatima radiallahu anha entered, he would stand from his seat and ask her to sit. This is at that young age, because we see that respect is reciprocal. When our children reach their teenage years and we say, my kid doesn't respect me, my kid doesn't respect his mom, he doesn't respect his father, he doesn't respect his teachers, the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we give our children respect? And I know it sounds contrary sometimes, from a cultural standpoint, it's like, no, the children have to respect the parents. But the model of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam was that respect is reciprocal. And when we look at an aspect of value dimension known as power distance, we see that for many of us, we come from cultures that are very high in terms of power distance, meaning we grew up maybe knowing that you don't talk back to your parents. We grew up maybe knowing that you don't question authority. We grew up maybe knowing that if a teacher, said jump, we say how high. Our children are growing up in a very low power distance society, and it is both cultural and generational. The US as a whole tends to be more low power distance. Generationally speaking, we are seeing the lowest power distance of any generation that preceded us, meaning that low power distance encourages the questioning. It encourages an equalization where there is no hierarchical structure in terms of levels of authority. So when we at home tell our children, listen to me, right? But in school, they may be encouraged to, if you see something, say something. You guys have seen these signs, right? Not just at the airports, they're popping up everywhere. And this is the mantra that's also being taught in many of our schools to our children, right? The idea is, speak up, talk out loud. And we may want our children to speak up and talk out loud in terms of their faith identity, in terms of correcting aspects that are wrong and indicative of, harm towards them if they are being bullied in a bad situation. But we also don't give our children enough guidelines to understand where there are going to be cases in which there is a level of high power distance, that there are going to be elements in which there does have to be those boundaries of respect. And so our children get confused because they feel that in the school atmosphere maybe, they're encouraged to speak up, to contradict, to question. In the home atmosphere, they are told, don't talk back, don't ask questions. Whether we verbalize that or we give them that response non-verbally. What does it mean to give them the response non-verbally? I remember years ago, my children are all older now, but years ago when they were much younger, I had my youngest was in kindergarten, and then I had my son in middle school, and my oldest daughter was in high school. And I remember, when I would pick them up from school, I'd pick up my kindergartner first, okay, and she would get in the car, and as soon as she would get in the car, it would be like, wirr, 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 wirr. She'd be like, Mama, I can't believe today, and I wouldn't even have to ask her how your day was, right? Immediately, she'd have like a ton of things to say. I dropped the crayon, and Amina picked up the crayon, and then Amina put it in her nose, and I told her that's disgusting, but then she kept putting it up her nose, and then I couldn't get the crayon back. And so many times when our children are in that first stage of tarbiyah, and they enter into the car, or we're doing something, maybe we're trying to get some work done, or maybe we're washing dishes, maybe we're cooking dinner, maybe we're in the middle of another conversation, and our children are like, mama, 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 or baba, 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 right? And we're like, oh, khalas ba'a, or like, enough, right? Stop bothering me, right? That is such a pivotal and important moment. Because when my daughter would get in the car and start talking about the crayon that was up Amina's nose, I had to stop whatever I was thinking about. I had to stop, if I was, trying to figure out something on Google Maps, or, my mind was somewhere else, and I had to listen because that was so important to her at that time. And so I had to ask her, what color was that crayon? And why do you think she put it up her nose? And what do you think would be a good way of responding to, Amina putting the crayon up her nose? Because that's her world at that time. And so often at that age, their world seems so different than ours. Rahmakumullah. And the message we sometimes send our children is that our world, our grown-up world, is more important than theirs. And this is the message that they will carry with them, so that when they enter their teenage years, and you ask, how was school? And they're like, fine. If you even get a grunt, like they're entering into a place where maybe in the younger years, their world wasn't that important, or it didn't feel that important to you when they looked at how you responded. And so in those teenage years, how is it going to shift? In their mind, remember, we're cementing the stage of security, we're cementing the foundation in those first 7 years, so that when they enter those teenage years, if they've developed that foundation and that security with you, recognizing that, yes, their world is important, and the crayon up their classmate's nose is just as important as everything else in your world, then they recognize that you want to listen. And we'll talk about, the conversations and the other stages as we get to them. But that stage is very pivotal. And again, we see the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in that stage as well with Fatima radiallahu anha. And there's a beautiful narration where we see that in some of the narrations, we see that Fatima radiallahu anha was either at the tail end of the first stage of tarbiyah or at the start of the second stage of tarbiyah. And in this narration, we see that there was a time when the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was praying on a hilltop. And the kuffar surrounded him, and they had reached into a dead camel, the carcass, and pulled out the guts and the filth from the inside of the dead camel. And they began to throw the filth on the back of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And as this occurred, Fatima radiallahu anha watched from the door of their home. And it broke her heart to see her father in this position, and so she ran from the home and ran up the hill and began to remove the filth from the back of her father, as the tears streamed down her face. And she sat beside her father, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and waited for him to finish prayer. And when he finished his salah, he turned to his daughter. And he didn't tell her, Fatima, this is no place for a female, go back to the home. He didn't tell her, don't make it a big deal, don't cry. He validated her emotion by wiping her tears, kissing her on the forehead, and telling her, do not be sad, for surely our Lord will allow your father to be victorious. So many times with our children in this stage, if we see crying, we see tears, we see agitation, we see emotions, what is our response? Don't be a baby. Grow up. Stop crying. What are you crying about? Rather than recognizing that whatever it is that is agitating our child in that moment is so important. It means a lot to them. Even if it is, I want that candy instead of this one. Even if it is, I don't want to go here, I want to go here. But in that moment, if our response is to invalidate the emotion, if our response is to tell our child that your emotion is not valid and you need to stop showing emotion, then it's no wonder at age 13, 14, 15, when our children are struggling in school, when they're struggling maybe with their mental health, when they're struggling maybe with depression and emotions, that they are not able to talk to us. Because what rings in their mind and what echoes is that moment when they were 4, 5, 6, 7, and you told them, don't cry. It's that moment when we invalidated our child's emotions. Validation is not necessarily the same as coddling or giving in. Right? Validation simply means a recognition and an awareness that this emotion exists, and guiding our children to understand why they may be feeling this emotion, why they may be expressing this emotion, is so much more productive in both the short term and the long term when we raise our children. So the next time we catch ourselves telling our children, don't cry, stop crying, grow up, let's stop ourselves. Let's get down to the same level as the child. Let's make eye contact with the child. Let's recognize and validate the emotion. So if there are tears, recognizing and saying, you're crying, that must mean that you're sad. Or maybe it means you're angry, or maybe it means you're frustrated. And then guiding our children to better understand their own emotions. Because how many of us as adults today even struggle with self-regulating our emotions? How many times does a cup of spilt milk send us into tears? How many times does a feeling that our spouse maybe doesn't understand what we're trying to say sends us into a fury where we raise our voices, or shuts us down where we stonewall and don't want to talk anymore? Believe it or not, for us as well, this response developed in our childhood. And this is where, when we talk about parenting, it's so important that we do the hard work of unpacking our own baggage. Because how many times growing up would you say something like, I'm never going to do that to my kids, or I'm never going to say that to my children, when our parents maybe responded in a certain way? And then here you are, 20, 30 years later, you're standing in front of your child, and maybe the child is having a tantrum, and you're saying, grow up, don't cry. And in that moment, you may think and remember and say, I sound just like my mom, or I sound just like my dad. Because we know that generational trauma is trauma that often continues. And it's trauma that if we don't resolve our own childhood trauma, we will replicate it. Or in trying so hard to avoid it, we will go to the opposite spectrum, which can also cause damage. So this is where I would say, in order to be able to parent and really apply a lot of these parenting strategies that we're talking about in a positive way, we also need to unpack our own negativity and to not be afraid to do that, to seek that counseling, to learn and better understand what is our attachment style, how do we show love, how do we understand love, how do we give love, and how do we want to be loved. And that kind of brings us to the next place in terms of that early stage again. Remember, we talk about security, we talk about cementing that foundation. We can't do that without the affirmation of feeling love or the validation of feeling love. But so often as parents, we give love in the way that we want to be loved, rather than giving love in the way that our child wants to be loved. So we have teens that will often come into our Cornerstone offices, that they're having difficulty, they're not connecting with their parents, and many times we'll hear the teenagers say things like, I know that my parents don't really love me, I know that they don't really care about me. And so a lot of times, when we're having a family session, we'll hear the responses. The mother may say something like, what are you talking about? I drop you off at soccer, I pick you up from soccer, I cook, the best biryani for you, I clean your clothes. What do you mean that's not love? And the father may say something like, I just bought you a $400 pair of Yeezys, or, what about that Xbox that I got you, or that PlayStation that I got you? And what we're seeing here in this dynamic is that the father may be speaking the language of gifting, the mother may be speaking the language of service, and the child is speaking the language of affirmation. If you haven't read a short little book called The 5 Languages of Love by Gary Chapman, I highly recommend it. And they have it, for romantic love between husband and wife. Read that. And they also have it for parenting as well, for children. Great little book. And there's, these quizzes that you can actually take online with your children. And I definitely encourage you to do that in order to better understand your language of love and to better understand the language of love that your children have. Most often, we see that parents who come from backgrounds that are highly service-oriented, so Southeast Asian backgrounds, Middle Eastern backgrounds, service-oriented, that rank high in terms of service orientation, most often we see that their language of love is service, right? For most of our children, born and raised here in the US, we tend to see the highest language of love, or the ranking, the language of affirmation. And we see it because, again, here, we hear a lot of parents complaining, in soccer, for instance, everybody gets a trophy, right? In school, for instance, a child goes from like a D on a test to a C, and the teacher's like, good job, I see improvement. And the child comes home, and you're like, I was gonna, I was thinking like, in Arabic terms, what I grew up with, Ida, ma'ula, you're getting a C, how is that possible? Rather than affirmation. And it may be seen as a form of encouragement, right? For us, a lot of times when we think, well, I'm encouraging my child, I'm motivating them. But imagine the contrast when the child is in school being told, good job on that C, and then they come home, and maybe they're even getting a B plus or an A minus, and you're like, seriously? You couldn't get 100 on the test? You had to get only a 90? Who got 100? Oh, that Susan, she's always getting hundreds, I don't know why you're not, right? And we go into this comparison mode, not recognizing that we may be derailing our children's language of love. And of course, each child is different, but the majority, we tend to see affirmation ranking very highly in the language of love of our children of this generation, and we see service ranking highly in the language of love of the parents of this generation. So the 5 languages of love are affirmation, time, touch, service, and gifting. So we talked a little bit about gifting, right? Giving of items, right? And sometimes a parent may feel like they're gifting because they, provide for the roof that's over the child's head, right? They provide the meals on the table. It may not be even like actual gifts. It may not be that $400 pair of Yeezys, but that may be a form of love. But the child may not interpret that as love. They may just interpret that as like, you have to do that. You're my parent, right? And it comes with a bit of assumption. We often label it as entitlement, but remember that nature versus nurture. What they are exposed to and what they're experiencing will impact their interpretation of what it means to be loved. Touch and time are 2 other very important ones. Remember what I talked about in the car ride with the children at that age. How often have we had children who are, pulling on our clothing, mama, 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 or baba, 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 right? And we're busy. We're, cooking, we're cleaning, we're working, we're on the phone with someone, we're, putting away laundry, maybe we're lying down, just trying to catch a few minutes of rest. That aspect of time is so critical in those early days because acknowledgement and validation and recognition that the child is important is indicative, or it's given essentially within that frame of time. So ensuring that we're able to convey, even if it's just with a word, with a look, connecting with our children with that sense of time. And that means putting this down. Putting this down because in so many households, in so many families, I will see parents who will say, my child is addicted to their cell phone, right? And as they're saying the child is addicted to the cell phone, and I ask them about their habits, oftentimes it'll be the spouse. The spouse will say something like, well, she's always on the cell phone all the time too, or he's always on the cell phone all the time too, right? So remember modeling the behavior, this needs to be put away. And it needs to be put away as a family project, right? Because before you know it, we're going to be entering into that second stage of tarbiyah, where we see most of our children asking for the cell phone, requesting the cell phone. I will be honest, my take just on what I see in terms of developmentally being ready, I do not really encourage giving the cell phone in the second stage of tarbiyah, which is age 8 to 14. I would say by age 15 to 21, that is the stage in which our children are developmentally mature and better able to make good decisions when it comes to these devices. And again, every situation is different, and we're going to talk about limitations and restrictions in a bit. So in that early stage, again, making sure that you are giving your child time, you're giving your child affirmation, touch. That's another hard one for our communities. Subhanallah, we know that Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was often carrying al-Hasan wal-Hussein. We know that Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would show his love and show that openly. And that aspect of touch was so important, even in terms of showing love to the mothers of the believers. And yet so many times in our households, our children don't see mama and baba giving one another hugs, giving one another, that soft touch on the hand, that touch on the cheek. And our children grow up seeing externally, maybe outside of the home, a whole lot of PDA, right? A lot of public displays of affection. And it trickles down because many times we won't give our children that sense of that hug, that hand holding, that kiss on the cheek. And again, because we are a lot of times service oriented in how we love, we may step away from that. But it's very important that we implement it. Not just that, those forms of giving hugs and gentle touches to our children when they're at that stage, but also one another, husband and wife. Because as accepting as our kids may be of hugs and touching and cuddling in age 0 to 7, we often see a shift in that next stage, especially when they enter into the preteen and teenage years. You try to hug your 12-year-old or 13-year-old and they're like, ew, get away from me, right? And a lot of times it's because they may not have seen the healthy touch modeled for them. So make sure that you're looking at what's happening within your home. And for those of you that are single parents as well, and I know we could have a whole other session just on that, but even for single parents, being able to model for your children, a healthy touch with your own parents, hugging your own parents, giving your parents that kiss on the forehead, that will carry through, and it is indicative of that healthy touch that we want our children to understand. So we said affirmation, we understand now time, touch, service, and gifting. And so we've talked about all of those, and we will see how they play out as we continue. So that's the first stage. Let's pause here for a moment. Are there questions about the first stage that we want to address, or do you want to keep questions till the end when we go through all 3 stages? Questions till the end? Yeah? Okay. Is there a question till the end, Zainab? Is that what you're thinking? Okay, perfect, inshallah. So we'll continue. I'm just going to grab some water if you don't mind. All right, bismillah. So now we enter the second stage, age 8 to 14. And subhanAllah, this stage is so critical. As much as we talked about laying the foundation in age 0 to 7, building that sense of security and that love, as we enter into the next stage, we're going to start to see the impact of that foundation. Because when our children enter into that second stage, and especially, at the midway point, we usually see it in the middle school years, maybe around 11 and a half, 12, 13, the age in which they're entering puberty. Is this the adhan? Are we breaking for salah? No, okay, it's not okay. So as we see them entering into this stage, so if that's someone's phone, I just don't want to speak over the adhan. Okay, thank you. So when we see the entering into that stage, the age 8 to 14, we see that shift that occurs, right? So those early days, and we are seeing our children reach the age of puberty earlier and earlier. And of course, we could go into the scientific elements of that, hormones in the food, the impact of changes in environment, but we are starting to see the prepubescent age starting right around 8, 9, usually by 10, 11, we're actually starting to see the emergence of the onset of puberty. So during this time, we know that our children tend to turn externally. No longer is it, mama and baba that, are the role models. No longer is it the household or the nuclear family unit that is this place of safety. A lot of times that becomes, a place of maybe agitation for the child, right? Maybe it's a space in which the child has grown up with a lot of fighting between mom and dad. And I can't tell you how many times I see parents who have very tumultuous relationships in their marriage, and they will come to our Cornerstone offices and they will say, well, we're going to stay together for the sake of the kids. And yet those same kids in those teenage years will say, I wish my parents got divorced because I grew up in a household, I grew up in a family where there was constant arguing, where there was constant dislike, where there was constant negativity, and no one had time really to focus on me or my needs or my wants. So this is not like an advocating for divorce, it is an advocating to get help. If your marriage is struggling, if you are having difficulties in the home between husband and wife, do not think that that will not affect your children. It will. It will affect them, whether in their own childhood and their teenage years, or it will affect them in their own marriages down the road. So get help. Don't think that it's independent, that you're doing a good job raising your kids, but in the meantime, your marriage is falling apart. No, it goes hand in hand, and we do have to look at it as a unit. And again, if you are in a situation where you're a single parent, also get help. it really does take a village, and that sense of the ummah, that we can't really raise our children alone. Seek out support groups, seek out connections with others in the community, seek out avenues in which you don't have to feel alone in this process of tarbiyah, because it's not easy. And this is why Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us that Jannah lies at the feet of mothers, and that the father who raises children and who are righteous and who continue to make dua for them after their passing, inshallah, will have that dua be mustajab and will also enter Jannah, inshallah. So we enter into this next stage now. 8, 9, 10 is often where we will also see evidence of mental health illnesses. This is usually the age of diagnosis. In the early years, age 0 to 7, we are definitely seeing an increase in diagnoses of ADHD and children that are receiving the label of being on the spectrum. So, different spectrums, of course, when it comes to autism, but we are seeing more and more diagnoses. We're also seeing a lot more medication prescribed to children in the early stage, with more formal diagnoses occurring around age 8, 9, 10. Of course, I am a huge advocate of seeking mental health help, but I'm also a huge advocate of doing your research and understanding where the opinions are coming from, and recognizing that one, psychiatrist's assessment is not the be-all and end-all. Do your research. We have specific organizations that we work with and groups that we work with that, alhamdulillah, are very careful and cautious before putting a label on. So just do your background work, because again, we do see, unfortunately, a lot of misdiagnoses at early ages of ADHD and autism, or being on the spectrum in particular, where maybe it may have just been more of a situation that needed a talk therapy type of approach, rather than something that needed medication or a diagnosis that will be with the child pretty much forever. So just be careful, but also be aware. Be aware that in those years, 8, 9, 10, 11, as the hormones are beginning to change within the child will experience changes. And they will experience changes in how they process the world around them. They will experience changes in their emotions. They will experience changes from a mental perspective in terms of how to respond, essentially, to all of the stimuli that are coming up at them. And those stimuli are going to be in the form of friends in school, because even if you ascribe to the idea that no cell phone until you're in that last stage of tarbiyah, many of their friends' parents will not ascribe to that. And so they will be accessing a great deal of information that you may not want them to access, that they may not be ready or prepared to respond to. In most cases of pornography addictions, we find that the first introduction to pornography comes around age 7 or 8. So most cases of pornography addiction start at the age of 7 or 8. And these are not necessarily children that had their own devices, but they are children who had access to it, whether it was on a home computer, whether it was someone showed it to them in school. This is, again, the age of curiosity as well. And it's also, from an Islamic perspective, when we look at the stages, this is the stage that we consider to be the age of discipline. And it's the age of discipline in which our children need boundaries. Our children need to hear no at this stage, but no with explanation, no with alternatives, not just no because I said so, not just no because it's haram, right? Which is a lot of times our go-to, and our children grow up thinking that there is more haram than there is halal, which we know is not true. So this is the stage where, again, we want to guide our children with, almost like when you think about the bumpers on the side of the bed, right? We move our children from their cribs, in the early stages, to a bed, but we don't let them, be on the bed without any bumpers or putting the bed close to the wall, right? Because we know they may still roll around. In this stage, 8 to 14, I want you to imagine those bumpers. You are still giving your children bumpers, but you're also allowing for some, rolling around. And in this stage, our children will probably mess up. And how we respond to their mistakes will also impact how they choose to move forward in terms of sharing information with us, connecting with us, letting us know what's going on, using us as a resource rather than using Google, to answer their questions, coming to us when they see something or when they're shown something in school and speaking to us about it. Because remember, we said that first stage, that communication, when the child gets in the car and, they want to talk and you want to listen. In that second stage, I remember, when I would pick up my son, in the beginning, I'd start my conversation, when he was in middle school, I'd be like, how was school? And again, I wouldn't even be able to get to, I'd be like, how was? He'd be like, fine, You know, did you do good on the math test? Again, I wouldn't even finish the statement. He'd be like, it was fine, good, right? And I realized that although the academic part maybe was important to me, it wasn't important to him in that stage of his life. And so I would sit with my husband and start learning about the Knicks and the Jets and, you know, whatever was happening in the sports world, so that when I would pick him up from school, I'd be able to say something like, man, can you believe those Knicks? Or, wow, like the Jets really have to fire their coach. He's terrible, right? Even though it wasn't an area of interest to me, entering into the car and being able to connect with him on something that was important to him helped us kind of get over that hump where I'd find him wanting to talk about the Knicks, wanting to talk about the Jets, wanting to talk about the sports. And then maybe later on in the evening, he of his own accord would be like, oh, by the way, I failed the math test today. You know? and then he would share that, right? Because it wasn't the primary area of interest. So this is the stage where we've got the bumpers in. We're recognizing that there is curiosity there, but we want to be that source that they turn to. So when we talk about, you know, pornography addictions, and we do see it developing quite a bit in this stage, unfortunately, when we look at statistics, the Muslim world is actually the highest consumer of pornography in the world. And this is a problem because it's not just happening, you know, in the Muslim world, you know, overseas. It is happening in our own homes. It is happening, you know, under our own roofs. And it's so accessible now, you know, and this is why I'm so, you know, cautious when it comes to these devices at a young age, right? Because a lot of times we will see households where maybe the child doesn't have a phone but has a laptop, and they are on the laptop in their room at age 13, at age 14, with the door closed. And, you know, the parent will say, oh, well, he has a big essay he's working on, or he's studying for his test. And I want you to imagine if 20 years ago, if we had given our children, you know, a stack of Playboy magazines and told them, you know what, I trust you. I know you're only going to read the articles. You're not going to look at anything bad because I know you know your deen. What would we have said to a parent who did that? We'd say that's ridiculous. Why would you allow for temptation to be there? Why would you give them this magazine that has, you know, an article or two that you want them to read when you know that there's so much that is so impermissible in there? And yet we do it with the laptops. We do it with the phones. We do it with all of these devices. We do it with the iPads. We do it with the iPods, right? And sometimes we get to this place where we think like, well, I've told my kids about the danger of, you know, seeing things that are inappropriate online. But the way that these apps have been designed, the way that these pornography sites have been designed, they are designed to be addictive. Our children, for example, at this stage who may be getting into gaming, you know, for a while, Fortnite was all the rage, right? And I know some kids are still into Fortnite, but, you know, we're seeing other games also coming up quite a bit now. But when you look at Fortnite, the creators of Fortnite actually spent 7 years in Las Vegas studying the habits of gamblers in order to better understand the mind and the gambling addiction and to develop that into a game. Which is why with a game like Fortnite, you'll see your child playing maybe, and they're like, okay, 5 more minutes, just 10 more minutes, just, you know, a couple more minutes. I almost won. I'm going to win the next one, right? Because it's designed in a way, just like gambling, to almost give you that sense of satisfaction, to almost give you that sense of completion with this idea that maybe next time, maybe next time. And so many of these apps are designed the same way. Why are our children addicted to TikTok? Why are they addicted to Snapchat? Why are they addicted to scrolling through Instagram? Because of the way the algorithms are designed, and particularly today, a recognition of how long your eyes remain glancing at one screen, for example, will indicate to the creators of these apps what it is that you like to see, and you will get more and more and more of those elements. And subhanallah, when we look to the Quran and we see Allah Azza wa Jal reminding us, أَلْهَاكُمَ التَّكَاثُرْ حَتَّى زُرْتُمَ الْمَقَابِرِ. The way we as human beings are designed is that we will always want more and more and more until we visit the graves. And so our children are no different. And at this very susceptible age, we know that this is the stage in which they are going between that transition of going from looking at the household as the primary input in terms of information and emotion and responses to looking at the whole wide world out there. And these devices play a huge role. So I always tell parents, you know, if you have a child, even before that second stage of tarbiyah, because now we're seeing it start at like age 5, 6, and even younger in some cases. But if you have a child, particularly in that second stage, you need to be very, very well educated and aware of what's out there in terms of social media. So it's not enough to just be on Facebook, okay? Because none of our kids are on Facebook. That's like the old people medium. And you may be thinking, like me, I finally figured out Facebook, and now it's irrelevant, right? But they're not on Facebook, right? And maybe a few years back it was Snapchat, right? It was Instagram. But right now, if you have children in that stage, you know that they are very much on Be Real. They are very much on, the newest one is called Gas. There's the Discord, of course. We see them quite active on Discord. TikTok, we were all familiar with, I'm sure, and how interesting the world of TikTok has become. And then know their YouTubers. Who are they following on YouTube? Because those influencers on YouTube, in that stage, again, once they start accessing, they have a lot more influence over our children than we do. And that will carry through with them into high school as well. So educate yourself. If you do not know how to use these apps, sign up for one of the adult schools that so many of them have classes now that it's like social media for dummies, or TikTok 101, or sign up, take those classes, go to your library, learn how to use these apps. We have so many parents who will say things like, I tell my kids not to go on any of the bad apps, right? But it's like, imagine that you have never left your house, or you've never crossed the street, and you tell your kids, make sure you look both ways when you cross the street. If your children have never seen you leave the house, cross the street, or look both ways, they're going to be like, psh, she doesn't know what she's talking about, or he doesn't know what he's talking about, right? So in order to model behavior for our children, we need to know what it is that they're accessing, we need to understand it, and we need to be able to access it. So many of our youth now use the app, which is essentially, it looks like a calculator, and underneath the calculator app, it hides another app, right? So if as parents we see more than one calculator on their phone, it's not because they love math, okay? Just be aware of what's out there. And again, so many parents like, I have parental controls, I know what happens. Our children know more, right? So it's not going to be about taking the phone and checking it every night, right? It's going to be about developing a relationship of trust with your children, where your children feel comfortable coming to you and saying, hey mom, I had my AirDrop on today, and a really nasty picture was AirDropped to me, right? Where your children will feel comfortable, and they know that you're not going to be like, stop it all, give me your phone, you're never taking it again, you're grounded for 2 weeks, right? Or saying, you know what, mom, I kind of messed up. I sent a DM to someone on Instagram, and I didn't mean for it to, be known, and somebody copied that DM and shared it. Whatever it is, you want your children to be able to come to you, to talk to you about DMs, to talk to you about their streaks in Snapchat, to talk to you about their B-Reels, and for you to know what they are talking about. Because at that stage, that's what's most important. So just like you want to know the color of the crayon in the first stage, in that second stage, we need to better understand their language, because our kids use their own language at that stage. And we all have, I remember when I was growing up, again, it was the 80s, so it was a while ago, but Michael Jackson was really big. And I remember, my sisters and I, we would walk around and we'd say to everything, we'd be like, oh, that's bad. And we meant like it was cool, right? Because that's, Michael Jackson had a song called It's Bad. And I remember my parents would get so upset. They'd be like, why are you saying it's bad? It's really good, And we'd be like, no, it's bad, And so this was a language that we had developed, right? And it was the language of the generation. Our kids are no different, right? And most of our children now are speaking in texting language, right? Very punctuated, very short, abbreviated, right? If you text them like a long message, you get like a K back, or like a thumbs up. Or now they don't even have to type the thumbs up, they just like the message and you get the thumbs up that way, right? This is the world that our children are growing up in, right? And yet so many times we'll be like, sit, talk to me, and yet their world has shrunk. It's not one in which there's a lot of talking done, right? What they're most comfortable with and familiar with, particularly post-COVID, particularly with the increase in virtual education. We know that screen time for children post-COVID, through this stage from age 9 actually up to age 18, has more than doubled. So our children today are using screens twice as much as they may have before 2020. So that screen time has doubled, and it's doubled because even within schools now, there's a sense of accessibility, right? With the hybrid education, or with assignments that are being done, or group work that has to be done over Zoom, or we see it in the workplace as well. That social distancing during COVID has definitely impacted us, impacted our families, and impacted our children. But again, awareness is key. And also being able to bring back that detachment. We often talk about zuhd from the Islamic perspective. And the concept of zuhd is being able to detach yourself from that which is in this dunya, and to detach yourself in a healthy way. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us that we are like strangers in this world, and that we should be like the traveler. The traveler does not get attached to that which is in our dunya. But think about our children. How attached do we get to these? Think about yourself, you and me. Think about you and your spouse. How attached do we get to these things? How attached do we get to our laptops? So one of the rules that we always recommend implementing is, first of all, no devices in bedrooms, ever. No devices in bedrooms, and this is not just for children, but this is for adults as well. Buy yourself an old-fashioned alarm clock. Do not use the excuse that, like, well, I have my alarm set on my phone. Get an old-fashioned alarm clock, and if you are going to implement a ruling on your child, implement that ruling first on you and your spouse. Meaning, if the rule in the household is no devices in bedrooms, then that applies to everybody in the house. And that's a healthy rule to have, right? Because the amount of increases in terms of insomnia, in terms of depression, in terms of anxiety at the adult level that is directly linked back to too much screen time, it's honestly just so incredible when you recognize how this has influenced our lives. And so it's healthy for us as adults to detach as well. So for example, in our household, we've always had the rule that by 9:30 p.m., no devices at all, right? So not just no devices in bedrooms, but also no devices at all. And that means that we have a central charging station in the kitchen, and everybody has to charge their devices at 9:30 p.m. Now let's say, there's an essay that has to be done. There is work that I have to do for my organizations. There was work my husband has to do. Our rule has always been, if you haven't completed your work, you wake up for tahajjud, and you finish up your work between tahajjud and fajr. And I cannot tell you how incredibly productive those hours are. Allah Azza wa Jal truly puts barakah in those hours. And even my own children will say they get so much more done in that hour, right, than they would have if they had stayed up all night. Because we know how distracted we can get, and how we open several windows at night, and when we're not fully concentrated or focused on what's happening, on what we need to get done, we find ourselves gravitating and navigating into different spaces. Implement this rule on yourself first, and as you implement it on yourself and on your spouse, you will see your children following. And just as a side note, I know my oldest daughter, she's in grad school now, but she had spent a year studying in Turkey. She was studying with a program, Quran and Fiqh and Islamic Studies. And while she was there, I was talking to her roommate. Her roommate used to call me sometimes. And so her roommate had called me once, and she's like, we really don't know what to do. By 9:30 p.m., Aya, who's my daughter, Aya makes us all put away our phones, and she won't let us use it until the next day. And so, subhanAllah, I feel like when we implement certain mechanisms for our children, they will recognize how beneficial it is, even if at that stage, they will probably push a little bit. They will probably remember the bumpers on the bed. They may think that they know, but this is the age of discipline. And this is the age in which we want to model positive behaviors. We also want to say no. But no with alternatives, no with understanding, and no with explanation. Why is that part important? So here we see that our children, as soon as they enter into high school, as soon as they enter into like a philosophy 101 class in college, we are seeing a great deal of turmoil often occurring. When children are in their philosophy 101 class, for example, in college, and the professor starts giving these, strange examples, and questions about God and the existence of humanity, and then they turn to the child and they say, what do you think? So many times our children are caught off guard, because in the first stage of tarbiyah and the second stage of tarbiyah, we focus a great deal on rote memorizations. We focus a great deal on black or white, on rahmakumullah, on halal or haram, rather than focusing on understanding and developing positive critical thinking techniques. What does that look like? So the child who in that first stage, right, and we know that Islamically we teach our children to pray at 7, and then by the time age 10 comes, remember those boundaries and those bumpers, that is the age of discipline where we are now telling them it is time to pray, and there will be hisab and there needs to be prayer. But when we teach them to pray, and we tell them, okay, this is how you pray, you raise your hands, you go into ruku', you go into sujood, do we actually guide them to understanding how this applies to their life? So being able to say, when you lift up your hands and you say Allahu Akbar, you are reminding yourself that Allah is greater than all of your difficulties, than everything in your life that you are putting behind you. When we enter into sujood, for example, recognizing that as our mind touches the ground, our heart is elevated and our heart is connected to Allah, because sometimes we're going to need to have those moments where we're not thinking or overthinking, but that we are connecting with our hearts. Are we making connections for them when we teach them Surah Al-Asr? And it's so interesting because a lot of times when I talk to teens and I ask them, what is the surah that they tend to pray with the most? Many times it will be either Surah Al-Ikhlas, Qul Huwa Allahu Ahad, or Surah Al-Asr. And when I ask them why, most of them because it's quick, without realizing and recognizing that, Surah Al-Ikhlas is considered by the heart of the Quran because it is about sincerity. It is the essence of our deen in terms of tawheed. Surah Al-Asr swears by time, where Allah Azza wa Jal is actually reminding us that you're going to be thinking about time as you move forward. So many of our children don't know this, and so they enter into their prayer, they enter into their memorization of Quran without an understanding of the applicability to their life. And so when they enter into Western education, secular education, and they are being told, think critically, give explanations that are rooted in understanding, we lose them. And we have so many of our youth turning to agnosticism, turning to atheism. Why? Because we haven't empowered them at those younger ages to understand how to respond, how to react, the why behind the what. There's an excellent book by Dr. Jeffrey Lang, and it's called Even Angels Ask. And in the book, he talks about how we often raise our children with a sense of it's haram to ask, it's haram to bring up certain things, right? But in this book, Dr. Jeffrey Lang uses the example of the fact that even when Allah Azza wa Jal created human beings, the angels who were created from nur, created to bow in prostration without question, they asked. And they asked Allah, why would you create a creature, a generation of individuals who will cause havoc on the earth? And so not silencing our children's questions, those why, but why, but why, right? Actually answering, and it can't be just because I said so. That is the worst answer that we can give as a parent. And it can't be because Baba said so either, or because Mama said so. It has to be an answer that they can understand, that's also age appropriate. And we see the example of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he sat with the Sahaba, and one of the youth of the Ummah approached him. And the young man said, I want to commit zina, I want to fornicate. And the Sahaba got upset. They were about to stand up to say, how could you come with such a lowly desire and present that to the beloved messenger of Allah? And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam stopped them. And he turned to the young man and he spoke to him from a critical thinking lens. He said, would you want someone to do this to your mother? Would you want someone to do this to your sister? Would you want someone to do this to your future wife? Would you want someone to do this to your future daughter? He spoke to the man in a language that he could understand. He spoke to the youth in a way that the youth connected and had to think critically about his response. And when the youth responded, no, 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 then the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam made the connection and said, well, then the person you will do this with may someday be someone's mother. The person you will do this with is somebody's daughter. The person you will do this with may someday be somebody's wife. And the young man nodded in understanding. And then the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam placed his hand on the heart of the young man and made sincere dua that this desire would be removed from his heart. And this is the component that we need to implement, and we need to implement it with our children from that early age, so that their whys are not rejected, that their whys receive an explanation that is understood in a language that they can understand. Because before we know it, we're in the last stage of tarbiyah. Right? And this is the stage from age 15 to 21. And this is the stage where we are seeing so many of our children struggling with loneliness, struggling with identity issues, struggling with LGBTQIA+, struggling with gender confusion, gender nonconformity, gender non-binary, struggling with pronouns, and struggling because for many of our children, we're not sure how to answer. We don't know how to respond. And struggling with addictions. And I'm not just talking about behavioral addictions like cell phone and laptops, but honestly, weed is an epidemic among our Muslim youth. And it's something that we need to address. And again, many times we don't, because we may still be stuck in the 80s, when we used to see this commercial on television that was an egg, right? And they'd say, this is your brain, and then there'd be a frying pan, and they'd crack the egg, and they would say, this is your brain on drugs. And then we all knew, like, okay, don't do crack, don't do cocaine, right? Like, that was it. That was the extent of the drugs. Our children today now are facing a massive amount of addictive substances. And it's not just weed, but so many of our children are addicted to K2 and spice. They're addicted to Molly. They're addicted to shrooms. They are addicted even to prescription medications that they are sharing among each other. So many youth will say things like, oh, I'm so anxious before this test. Give me one of your Xanax. I'm so nervous, or I feel really sad, and then their friend might be like, here, take one of my antidepressants. Okay? Take a Lexapro, it'll help you, it always makes me feel better. And what we're seeing are addictions that are developing for prescription drugs, whether they're being shared without the prescription, or prescription drugs that they are being given by psychiatrists when there may be a misdiagnosis. Because so many of our children are receiving diagnoses of depression and anxiety, and not to debunk it or not to dismiss it, because so many of our children are struggling with depression and anxiety that is clinically diagnosable, but many of our children also struggle with situational anxiety and situational depression that can sometimes be misdiagnosed as clinical. Situational anxiety, situational depression is linked to the situation. So we have definitely seen a skyrocketing number of increased incidents or diagnosable incidents of depression and anxiety among youth post-COVID. But how many of those are diagnosable, chronic or clinical, and how many are situational? And that's where we as parents need to step in as well. Not to go to WebMD and Google the symptoms and say, okay, this is what you have, because that's what a lot of our youth do, right? But educating ourselves also on the mental health of our children and what they may be facing, and being the advocates for our children. So if the school guidance counselor says, I'm worried about your child, you need to take them to a psychiatrist, do your research, right? Understand, what is the psychiatrist going to address, and how will they address it? How is it different from the psychologist? How would that be different than, going to an LSW? How would that be different than going to an LPA? How is that different from going to a CBT, a cognitive behavioral therapist, or a dialectical behavioral therapist? The information is there. And sometimes it's just about asking a question. If you face that, for example, you can always message our office at Cornerstone, and our staff will definitely provide you with information. FYI, the Family Youth Institute out of Ohio, Dr. Samira Ahmed, they have amazing infographics that explain the differences of mental health providers and what you may want to know. So don't go into these things blindly, because right now, honestly, in the US, there is a war that is being waged. And it's a war that's being waged for the hearts and the minds of our children. And unfortunately, it's a war that is pushing our children towards secularism, because faith is feared. When a child is connected to their faith, when a child is connected to morality, it becomes harder and more difficult for a government, a capitalistic government that is focused on materialism, to own them. But when you remove faith as an identity, when you introduce instead desire, that's almost like the God that they worship, then you can manipulate the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. And that is what is happening in our schools currently. It is what's happening in Hollywood. It is what's happening on Disney Channel. It is what's happening in the games that we see. There is a very clear reason as to why the LGBTQIA+ agenda emerged faster than any trend in the history of trends. The widespread acceptance, more than acceptance, the pushing of this agenda upon our children. The genderbread curriculum was introduced in New Jersey Believe it or not, it was actually introduced 2 years back. We only started to hear the protests and whatnot and the ruffles being made currently, most recently, within the past year or so. But the gender-bread curriculum begins actually in kindergarten, and it requires every school, every classroom, to have the poster of the gender-bread man essentially up, in which children from that young age, stage 1, are encouraged to enter into the classroom and are asked, how they feel. And not how they feel, do you feel good, do you feel happy, do you feel sad, but how do you feel in terms of your gender? That, do you feel like a girl, do you feel like a boy, do you feel like neither, how do you feel in terms of your sexual orientation? Are you being attracted to girls, are you being attracted to boys, or is it neither? And this is something that's taught at a young age, and it develops, as we see now, if you have children that are in the college space, or if you even work in the corporate world, you'll see pronoun usage, right? Having to identify as, what are your pronouns? She, her, they, them, he, his, right? He, him. And what we're seeing is our children are very confused because, again, we don't necessarily talk to them about sex. We don't talk to them about gender. We don't talk to them about these forms of identity. But I guarantee you, every day they step out of the house, they are bombarded with talk and conversation about sex, about gender, and about identity. So we need to start having these conversations at home, and we need to be able to open this dialogue with our children. My recommendation, honestly, is start young. Start at age 7 or 8. There is a beautiful book. There's 2 books, actually. One is written by Sami Khan, I believe is the author. It's called A Muslim Boy's Guide to Life's Big Changes. And the other one is written by his wife. I believe her name is Ruqayya something. And it's A Muslim Girl's Guide to Life's Big Changes. These books are not super informative. I see them as discussion starters. They are a way to start the conversation with your children. And at age 7 or 8, I would say make it bedtime reading. And for the boys, read both the girls' book and the boys' book. And for the girls, read both the boys' book and the girls' book. Because it's worded in a way that's very gentle, that is very Islamically appropriate, but it starts the conversation. It allows your children to know from that age, that young age, that it's not a taboo topic to talk about your body, to talk about your desires, to talk about puberty. I have teenage girls who will come to the office with a great deal of difficulties and, identity issues. And sometimes they'll say things like, my mom never talked to me about my period. I had to learn about it from my friends. Or, when the family prays, I actually have to pretend I'm praying because my mom doesn't want my brother to know that I have my period, right? This is not a safe space when our children are going out into public and these words and terms are used, in a very casual way. So we have to try to create that safe space in our households and our homes, because what we're seeing in terms of the LGBTQIA+ agenda is that our children who are going through this normal stage, and that particularly that last stage of tarbiyah, where they are struggling to know who they are, when they don't know their identity, when they're questioning, which we've all been there, right? Questioning their value, their validation, their affirmation, they hear from the other side, love is love. We are inclusive. There's rainbows, there's butterflies, there's even unicorns now for gender-affirming perspectives. And they see this, and they are cold to it. Because on the opposite side of the fence, what they're hearing is haram, 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 right? What they're hearing is go to the masjid, pray, fast, right? Without an explanation, without an understanding, without a connection of the beauty of our deen to who they are and how they carry themselves. And so we need to be able to change that narrative, because love is love. Love is Allah. Allah is Al-Wadud. Allah is the one who loves humanity with a love that's greater than any human love. Do our children know this? Do our children know this, or do our children only know Allah is Al-Hakam? He is the judge. And so when we guide our children towards recognizing and understanding who they are, we need to ensure that the connection that they're making with the deen is a connection in the heart, as well as in the mind, as well as in the soul, as well as in the relationship, as well as in the emotional, that holistic perspective. And we're not going to get them there if we're just saying, did you pray? Make wudu again, your elbows are not wet enough, right? We're not going to get them there. And yet this is what so many of our children grow up believing and grow up thinking. So that final stage is incredibly important because it is going to build upon, of course, the earlier stages, but we also know it's the stage in which our children are most ripe for relationships. And when I would give this talk, like maybe 10 years ago, I want to say, when I would talk about relationships, the focus was more on opposite gender, right? Who's dating who, which guy likes which girl, and which girl likes which guy. Today, there is a huge shift in the relationship dynamic. And our children are so confused because when we try to talk to them about homosexuality, for example, a lot of times their first approach is, you're homophobic, right? I have a best friend and my best friend came out as gay and my best friend is the nicest person in the world. Why don't you like gay people? And because our conversations are not nuanced, because we enter into this space with a sense of fear and like, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, we turn our children away. We need to learn how to talk about these topics, and we need to have those nuanced conversations, right? And in order to do so, it has to be a part of the fabric of our home life, being able to discuss these things without that fear. And yes, of course, we discuss them with hayat, but we empower our children to understand that they will be hearing these terms without hayat, and that their approach to them, when they hear it without hayat outside of the home, is to understand and to respond in a way that is rooted in our deen. So it's incredibly critical, again, for us to educate ourselves first, to know how to respond. So the child who comes to you and says, my best friend just came out as gay, your first response may be, astaghfirullah, don't talk to them ever again, delete them from your phone right now, right? Don't let that be your first response. Don't let that be your first response, your second response, or your last response. Don't respond that way, okay? We cannot parent out of a place of fear. We need to parent out of a place of love. And we see this in the example of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, when he was on a journey once with one of the youth from the Ummah, sitting on his, the animal that he was riding, sitting behind him, and he was stopped by a woman. And the woman, we understand from the narration, was someone who was very beautiful, because the youth turned to look at the woman, and the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not rebuke him, but he simply held his chin and turned it the other way. And then the youth turned again to look, and again the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam turned his chin the other way. And a third time he looked, and again he turned his chin the other way. What we must do as parents is just turn our children's chins to guide them to better understand what the right way is. So the child that comes with you, maybe not even talking about a friend, maybe talking about themselves and saying, you know what, I think I'm gay, right? Not reacting in a way that is so extreme. Or they may say, I'm pansexual. They may say, I'm identifying as asexual. I'm identifying as demisexual. All of these identifications are problematic because it makes sexuality an identity as opposed to an action or a desire. And this is the first time in the history of child development that we see actions endorsed as identity. So what does that mean? From an Islamic perspective, teaching our children about the nafs is so critical. And again, we want it to be implemented throughout the stages. So we know in the Quran, we are told that there exists within each of us 3 levels of the nafs. There is the nafs al-ammara, the nafs al-lawwama, and the nafs al-mutma'inna. The nafs al-ammara is the side of the nafs that gives into desire. This is the side that is being cultivated among our societies today. It's the side where you feel that something feels good, and so you do it. You feel an emotion, you act upon it, right? And that's what our kids are being taught. The nafs al-lawwama is the conscious self. It's the self that thinks things through, that maybe they recognize the desire, they see that it's there, but they think about the consequences. And the nafs al-mutma'inna is the highest level of the self, the contented self. And it is the self that recognizes what is good, what is halal, what is pure, and that willingly acts upon it. So at each stage of tarbiyah, we want to have this conversation in a way that's age appropriate. So for example, we often use the example of chocolate cake when the children are younger. That if I look at chocolate cake, my nafs al-ammara may say, eat the cake. It's so yummy. Eat the whole thing because chocolate is so good. And I might eat the whole thing, right? If I follow the nafs al-ammara, I might actually eat the entire cake. And in the moment, it may taste good. But what's going to happen after? I'm going to get a stomach ache. I'm going to feel disgusting. I'm going to gain 10 pounds, right? It's going to be terrible. So the nafs al-lawama will step in. And the nafs al-lawama might say, oh, the cake looks so good. I really want a piece of that cake. You know, maybe I'll just have a nibble. Maybe I'll have a bite. And the nafs al-lawama might stop me from eating the whole cake, but it might make me feel like, oh, I still want it. And that's the part of us that we want to continue to strengthen, the understanding of why something is not beneficial to us, and strengthening the soul to get to a place where we are embracing avoidance of that which is not beneficial. Because the nafs al-mutma'inna is when we get to a point where we look at the chocolate cake and we say, okay, that's a chocolate cake. And even though it may have, you know, a good taste to it, it has, I don't know, 1,000 calories, it has a great deal of fat, it has all of these negative things in it. So you know what? I don't want the chocolate cake. I'm going to have a carrot instead. And to feel so contented with knowing what's wrong with that cake and deciding consciously to choose not to partake of the cake because it is harmful. And as our children grow older, understanding that our desires will change, and it may not be a desire for chocolate cake. Maybe we have a desire to be in a relationship, and maybe because everybody around us, or, you know, or because we've misplaced the concept of companionship, we admire someone, we are drawn to them, that someone is of the same gender, and we begin to look at that someone like we'd look at a chocolate cake. And when society is pushing you to be proud of identifying in a way that is prohibited Islamically, our children may gravitate towards that. And just like the chocolate cake, maybe they'll partake of it, or maybe they won't, but they'll feel like, man, I really want to fulfill that desire. And so we want to guide them towards that nafs al-mutma'inna, the contented self. And there are definitely ways that we can do that, but I'm recognizing that it's already 12:30 and we wanted to leave about 30 minutes for Q&A. So I'm actually going to pause my talk here because, again, the process of tarbiyah takes us, 21 years, right? And we can't complete 21 years of tarbiyah in just an hour and a half discussion. So I'm going to pause here so that I can take your questions, your comments, your concerns. If you have advice in terms of you raising your children, please feel free to share. Jazakumullahu khair.
This is one of the most extraordinary, mind-blowing talks I've ever heard. I listen to a lot of parenting podcasts and just the best practices. Extraordinary. My question is, how can we all access more of these resources? I wrote down all the books that you suggested, but Cornerstone, I've never heard of it. Could you tell us more about that? How can we access it? Are there lectures we can bring our children to? I would love to come and see more of you and have my kids come to see more of you. Thanks.
There we go. Okay. Jazakallahu khair, sister. May Allah Azza wa Jal bless you and protect your children, protect all of our children of the Ummah. So I did bring with me, we do have a Parenting in the Modern Age program that's actually free, and it's online. It's held on Tuesdays and Saturdays. If you go to our website, you can definitely sign up for that. It is free. We do it in sessions. So the fall session just ended, and the winter session should begin again within the next week or so. We do it in conjunction with the New York Muslim Center in Queens. So it's in person on Tuesday in Queens, but we also have an online component, and on Saturdays it's also just online. Or switch that, it might be Saturdays in person and online. And some of our Cornerstone interventionists run that program. So you can definitely sign up for that. If you go to our website, which I have lots of cards for Cornerstone here, we have free teen and women support groups. So our teen boy support groups run every Thursday night, and our teen girls, I believe, runs on Saturday, and our women's support group runs on Sunday. We are adding a male support group because we've had a great deal of interest in that. So inshallah, that session just ended as well, and the winter session should begin in January, I believe. On our website, you'll find all the information for that. These programs are run over Zoom, and alhamdulillah, our teen support groups have been amazing because we get teens signing in from all over the world. Cornerstone is an international nonprofit, so we have 5 offices here in Jersey, and we have offices in London, Ontario, in Sandwell and Dudley, outside of Birmingham in England, and then throughout the US we have offices. You can definitely learn more about what we do at Cornerstone from our website. We are in Bridgewater, so the closest office to Bridgewater is probably our Piscataway office, which is at 30 Knightsbridge Road, and then we've got offices in Princeton, in the Metro Park area, in Cranford, Linden, and a few other places. And you know, we do offer what we consider an alternative therapeutic intervention, which is faith-based therapy, so counseling that's rooted in the Islamic perspective and that is holistic in its approach. And we have a marriage department, we have a parenting department, we have a youth department that focuses on identity, sexuality, and relationships. We have an addiction therapy program, we have an anger management program, we have a grief and loss program, and we also have geriatric care, life changes, and our largest department is actually our refugee division, and we do provide integration intervention for all of the 8 VOLAGs that bring in refugees. And we also offer our services in 14 different languages. So we offer it in Arabic, Dari, Tamil, Pashto, Tigrinya, Urdu, and a couple of others, Spanish, French, and a few others. But yeah, so you can learn a lot more about our programs here. We do offer youth lectures pretty consistently. We go to different schools and provide workshops. We have a team of several interventionists, so if it's not me, you'll see some of our other interventionists on site. And when we're done, you can definitely grab some information, check us out. I also brought some of my books with me that are here for purchase if anyone's interested when we're done with the program.
I forgot to say that if you guys have any questions and you don't feel like speaking, you can write it up here. We have papers. Thanks.
Cool. Salam, sister, and I'll echo the sentiment the other sister said. This is a great talk. So my question is a little bit more specific. I'm trying to figure out how do we have conversations with our kids about fame and popularity, because they're surrounded in the echo chamber where Lux life is everything. And when, in contrast, the conversations we have is, oh, you should live a humble, kind, thoughtful, fun life, it's very lackluster of a message. So I think my question is more as a parent, how do I guide my kids towards, well, there's a meaningful life to live versus what you see in YouTube, you know? So my question is along those lines.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. I think that's a great question. You know, we talked a little bit about affirmation before, and studies are showing that youth who are very focused on getting likes online, that are very focused, which is a large swath of the population right now, right? A lot of times it is a sense of missing affirmation, wanting more affirmation, wanting more validation. So the first step would be, as parents, we want to give that affirmation and validation, even if it's not something we're used to, even if it's not the way that we were raised, because I would venture to say that most of us were probably raised in households where we heard do better more than we heard good job, you know? And again, a form of encouragement, different generation, right? So definitely starting with affirmation in the home. Also understanding and recognizing, you know, with the children, I think it's important that they know the downside. And I'll give you an example. There was a very well-known YouTuber, actually, right here from New Jersey, my neighbor in Princeton, his name is FusiTube, or his online handle is FusiTube. His actual name is Yusuf Barakat. So he was an individual who gained massive popularity at the start of YouTube as a YouTuber doing pranks. And initially his pranks were more focused, you know, Islamic-centric, you know, him and his mom, you know, kind of funny, light things. As he became more steeped in fame, he had to kind of do things that were more risque, you know, really outside of the scope maybe of the foundation that was his life, essentially. Long story short, a few years back, right before COVID, he lost everything because of a situation on YouTube where somebody else, you know, accused him of something, all sorts of things, right? He now actually tours the nation talking about the downfalls of seeking fame. Look him up, you know, find out, because especially if your children are in stage 2 or 3, you're not going to be the source of authentic information for them about YouTube or TikToks, right? They're just going to hear it as like, wah, 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 you know, mom and dad just, you know. So I would say find, remember when we said speak their language? Sometimes speaking their language means finding someone else who speaks it, because we're not always going to be able to. So he's a great resource, especially, because he does come from that Muslim background. Walk them through the actual examples. And don't do it in a way like, see what happened to this person? Instead, bringing it up in a way where you could be like, funny thing, the other day I was online and I ran across this, this really interesting, short about, so-and-so, or I ran across this reel about XYZ. Maybe you want to take a look at it, right? Send it to them, right? Don't even tell them what it's about, right? Hopefully they will look at it. If they don't, again, you don't want to nag, but you want to be like, hey, maybe you didn't get a chance to look at this. Let's watch it together now. So again, speak their language. Don't just try to lecture them, but convey it through a visual medium, because that's what they speak right now. And then hopefully with enough examples where they're able to see the downfall of fame. And it's not just Muslims. I mean, we see, many non-Muslims in that sphere that turn to drugs, that turn to addiction, because fame itself can be addictive. And when it decreases, what do we see? We see a lot of times, many of the stars taking their own lives because it's not enough. And we didn't get to talk about suicide ideation, but that's another really rampant issue in our communities. So just really quick, don't ignore your children's cries if they are harming, self-harming, cutting, if they are, into kind of addictive substances in a way that is clearly, wanting to harm themselves, or if they indicate any form of suicide ideation. Don't ignore it. Don't just say, oh, they're seeking attention. Don't just say, don't get mad at them and be like, I can't believe you would say that. Now the guidance counselor says, I have to take you here. Recognize it as it is a cry for help, and it's a child who is really missing something, struggling with something. So just don't ignore it. Just another side note. There was a study that was released a few years back, I believe about 2 years ago, by Dr. Rania Awad from the Islamic Psychology Lab of Stanford University. And it indicated that Muslim youth in America who are 18 to 21 are twice as likely to attempt suicide as non-Muslim youth. So this is a huge problem in our communities as well. Again, we want to talk about it because so many times we see youth that pass away, and a lot of times in our masajid, they will say, oh, he passed away in his sleep, or she passed away, suddenly. So many of those cases are suicide cases, but we don't necessarily talk about it. So we need to understand that it's there, it's happening, suicide attempts as well as suicide ideation. Okay, so I'll take the written questions and then we'll go back to the verbals. Okay, so there was a question about insurance for Cornerstone. Definitely visit our website. You'll find all the information there. We are a nonprofit, so we do sliding scale. We cannot accept insurance because we're considered a spiritual advising organization, meaning if a child comes to us, for instance, and says, I'm gay, we will tell them, let's talk about identity and let's try to understand what your identity is actually comprised of, rather than affirming, for example, sexual orientation as an identity or gender identity. So we can't accept insurances because, like I said, we're an alternative therapeutic intervention and we are faith-based. But if you email our office, we do sliding scale and we try to work with everyone. We try never to turn anyone away. What is the right way to respond to your children when they call you homophobic? Okay, excellent. First of all, understand what homophobia is and explain it to them, right? Let them know that for someone to be homophobic means they have to be hateful towards the person. To be homophobic, you have to be someone who rejects the person, who judges the person. And that our deen does not teach us to be hateful towards anyone. Our deen does not teach us to judge anyone because Allah Azza wa Jal is Al-Hakam Al-Adl, right? He is the most fair of all judges. Right? So first explain the concept of what a phobia is, right? That it's rooted in a fear, that is rooted in dislike, that's rooted in judgment, and that's not our deen. Then second, explain to them that maybe there is a little fear because you don't really understand, the whole LGBTQIA+. This is where vulnerability is so important. If your response immediately to your child is, no, I'm not homophobic, right? You're invalidating. You're basically telling them what you say doesn't make sense. What you say is wrong. And everything you say after that, they're not going to listen to it. So show some vulnerability. Tell them, the word homophobic means having a fear of individuals who act upon homosexuality, and it's a fear that's often rooted in a judgment, right? You fear them because you're judging their action. That's not of our deen. I would never judge someone. That's not what I'm taught Islamically. But, the reason why you may think I'm homophobic is because I'm not as comfortable or familiar with the homosexuality identity that is emerging in your generation, right? So share that vulnerability. Let them know that you understand why they're calling you homophobic. Don't dismiss it. Then follow it up with an explanation of what your stance is. And maybe at that point you might say something, the reason why I get worried sometimes when you talk to me about your friends coming out and identifying as gay or pansexual, demisexual, or any other of sexualities is because the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that a friend is like a mirror onto another friend. And that is sahib sahib, that who you are friends with will likely pull you towards what they are involved in. But I also understand that in today's society, a lot of young people are trying to know who they are and what their identity is. And many of your friends may feel that sexuality is the path to their identity. And then start talking about sexuality and identity. Start talking about what it means to have a strong faith identity and why that moral compass will guide not just your child, but other children as well. But it's a conversation, and it's a process. And they may leave that first conversation and still be like, well, yeah, you're homophobic, and that's okay, right? Tell them, what, I think this was a really good conversation. Why don't we talk about it again, tomorrow? Why don't we sit together? So let it be ongoing. Don't close the door. And again, don't invalidate what your child says, even if they're wrong, even if their perspective is still valid. And again, you want them to recognize and understand that you hear them, right? We always say that Allah Azza wa Jal gave us 2 ears so that we could listen more, and 1 mouth so we could talk less. But as parents, we usually do the opposite, right? We're usually talking more and not listening as well. All right, so we answered this question. Let's look at the next one. Okay, this is a good question. Do you recommend Islamic school versus public school, and where did my own children go? So I'll be honest, I'm a little biased in this question, only because I taught in an Islamic school for many years. I served as the guidance counselor in an Islamic school for many years. I was the vice president of the board of an Islamic school for about 10 years, and my children did all attend Islamic school. To be honest, being someone who not only went through the public school system here in the US, but also being very involved with public schools in terms of mental health outreach and programs that we do in the public schools today are very different than what they were 10, 20 years ago. And our decision, like with our children, for example, we initially started on the homeschooling path, and then when it became difficult to manage kind of homeschooling, and then my studies and then my husband's work, we researched quite a bit, in terms of schooling, because it's never easy, right? And there's pros and cons to everything. I would say whatever school you send your children to, be as immersed and as involved as possible. Because not everyone can send to Islamic school. Not everyone has that option, whether it's distance or the finances. It's not always easy. But, I always tell everyone, it took me 21 years to finish my PhD. 21 years. And the reason for it taking 21 years is in between that time, I was working in the Islamic school with my children. I was, the coach of their mock trial team, and my husband was coaching their soccer team and, the basketball team. And we only have such a short window. Like, as much as I look at those 21 years of getting my PhD, to raise our children, we basically have 21 years, right? That's the process of tarbiyah. After age 21, of course, we don't ever stop parenting, but from an accountability standpoint, now they are accountable for themselves. So I am a big fan of Islamic schools if you're able to, but this does not mean that the issues that I talked about in the last stage are not prevalent in Islamic schools. We see a lot of issues in Islamic schools as well, in terms of gender identity confusion, sexuality issues, issues where maybe there's mental health struggles, issues where there is turmoil or abuse in the home that is reflected in the behavior of the children. It's not perfect, right? Any environment we put our children in, again, they're an amana, they're entrusted to us, and we need to be able to trust the environment. And I do think sometimes it's hard to trust the environment if you are removed from it. So be involved. If you can't teach in the school, volunteer in the school. If you can't, be as immersed in it maybe as you'd like, make sure that you are at every parent-teacher conference, that you maybe are part of the PTO, be involved. Again, public, private, homeschool, we see the whole gamut and we see difficulties in each of those areas. No environment is perfect, but we have to be very involved and immersed in it. So, and definitely if you have personal questions about Islamic schools, you can come up and ask me as well, or homeschooling, since we did that for a bit as well. All right, if the kids are already in phase 2 of tarbiyah and almost entering phase 3, how do you develop the habit of staying off the devices at night without creating a power struggle? Okay, great question. So our children, again, are creatures of habit, and this is why, I'm so keen on start at age 0, right? If you are expecting a child, then start working on weaning yourself off of devices before that begins. But let's say you haven't. Let's say you're at a stage now where you do feel like your children have developed a behavioral addiction to their devices. You mentioned a power struggle, right? So remember how we talked in the beginning about power distance and authority? So our children are in a place now where, as young as 13 in the state of New Jersey, children can choose to have gender-affirming surgery or take gender-affirming hormonal therapy without parental consent. This is at 13, right? We know that at 16 in the state of New Jersey, in certain aspects, children are not considered minors. And it's always fascinating to me that you have to be 21 to vote in this country. You have to be 17 to drive. You have to be 18 to vote, 21 to drink, right? But you only have to be 13 to go through life-altering surgery to make decisions that impact your body. So yes, your children are going to have this low power distance approach, but this is where the bumpers go up, right? So it's okay to tell your children no. Even if they are at age 14, 15, 16, 17, it's okay to say no. The state law in New Jersey for emancipation is age 16. Emancipation is when a child goes to court and says, I don't want my parents to have any say over me anymore. But the good thing is the rules for emancipation are very stringent. And so, not letting me have my cell phone at night is not one of the guidelines for emancipation. Your children cannot emancipate themselves from you for telling them no phones at night. So I would say just start. Just let them know, listen guys, I was reading up on the impact of the blue light. I wouldn't even bring it from an Islamic perspective per se at this point. I might say something like, I was reading up on the impact of blue light on our sleep, insomnia, mental health, and the long-term impact it has on us. So I am actually going to stop accessing any of my devices after 9:30, 10, whatever it is, I'm not gonna keep it in the place where I sleep because it can impact me. So I'm buying alarm clocks for everybody, and from now on, we're going to charge externally. Put that rule out there. When they push back, find ways to give the consequences, and the consequences have to kind of fit the crime, right? So it's not like, okay, you're punished for a week, and you're not allowed to, go on your phone at all for a week. No, find something that fits. So it's like, okay, if you're not going to leave your device outside of the room, then, tomorrow, you're actually not taking your device to school with you. I'm going to keep the device with me, right? So find consequences that fit. Is there going to be a power struggle? Your child is probably going to get emotional. It's probably going to say it's not fair. Good moment, an opportunity for conversation. Okay, tell me why. What is it that makes you feel this need to have your phone with you in your bedroom? What is it that makes you feel this need to be on your laptop in your bedroom, right? Let's use the laptop in the dining room. Let's use it in the kitchen. If you feel like you can't study there, okay, keep it in your bedroom, but the door is not closed. You've got to keep the door open. Let's find ways where you can have conversation little by little. Again, when you think of the prohibition of alcohol at the time of Jahiliyyah, it was such an important part of their lives. When the mandate for the removal of alcohol came, it came in stages, right? It was first, do not approach salah while intoxicated. And when the people began to realize that basically there's 5 times a day of salah, it's really hard to drink in between there, they would drink at night. And then when there was that removal of the consistency of the alcohol, then the mandate came of the complete removal of it. So we have to do the same with our children, right? Take it in stages, but start somewhere. Don't wait, because before you know it, they'll be done with stage 3 as well. And then that's kind of like the end of the Islamic conceptualization of tarbiyah. Right, we have a couple more questions. Are there verbal questions? We could pause and take some verbal questions if there's any verbal questions that you want to ask. Okay, so we'll answer these two questions too. Okay, another question about Islamic schools. Do they help create the right environment, or are they still not addressing external societal issues? So thank you for bringing me back to this, because the one positive that I do see, well, one of many positives that I do see in Islamic school is that if a child is struggling with sexuality, struggling with gender identity, struggling with addictive behavior, it is not reinforced by the teachers. It is not encouraged by the guidance counselor. As far as I can see, in the Islamic school, at least that I'm most familiar with, which it's Nur al-Iman school that's up in the Princeton area. So I feel like the role models who are the teachers are generally speaking modeling behavior that aligns with our deen. Not always though, not always. We know that Islamic schools have their fair share of problems. And this is why, again, the parents must be involved in whatever school, whatever educational facility you send your children to. The school cannot be the one that's raising your children for you. So I would say there are some positives by the environment. Also, a lot of times we see children growing up in similar households where something that is not allowed for one is also not allowed for the other. But we'll also see variations in that. And I know some parents will tell me, well, in public school it's easy because I can say, oh, well, they're not Muslim, that's why they do that. But in Islamic school it's harder because everybody's Muslim. So they're going to be like, well, they're Muslim and they do that. Again, differentiation is an important aspect to teach our children regardless of the community that they're in. So letting them know and understand why, for example, in Surah Al-Rum, Allah Azza wa Jal in verse 20 reminds us that we have all been created in different parts of the land, أَبَشَرٌ تَنْتَشِرُونَ, that we were dispersed as human beings. Why are we reminded in that surah that we have different tongues and that we, اختلاف ألسنتكم, the differences in our tongues will impact how we relate. Teach your children these differences from a young age so that if they go to Islamic school, if they go to a Muslim majority country, if they go to public school, regardless of where they are, they will know that there are sometimes differences. And those differences are not necessarily of a religious nature always, but sometimes it has to do with the way that parents choose to parent. And if you are choosing to parent in a specific way, parenting out of love, not parenting out of fear, your children will know that. But if you parent out of fear, where like, no, you can't have sleepovers because I'm afraid of what's going to happen there, the children will feel that as well. Instead, if it's like, well, you can't have a sleepover because it's not something that works for our family, but what you can do is spend all day with your friends and then I'm going to pick you up at this time. And again, stage 2, you're giving the explanation, you're maybe identifying why you don't feel comfortable with that. You're giving the bumpers. And even if say, oh, it's not fair, that's okay. You're the parent. This is where the power distance comes in. And if your child has never said it's not fair, then you're doing something wrong, okay? Our children will experience that. How can we get our fathers more involved in spending time with the children, with homework, with playing games? They come home from work, they watch TV, and they relax while the wife has to make dinner, do laundry, help with homework, take them to activities, etc. So, subhanAllah, when we look at the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, we know that when Aisha radiallahu anha was asked about, his activities, what he does, she said that when he is not in worship or at the masjid, he is in service to his family. And in service to his family meant that he would sometimes, be darning the socks, he'd be helping in the kitchen, he'd be, again, the tarbiyyah that the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam taught us through his own tarbiyyah of Fatima radiallahu anha, was incredibly involved, right? Incredibly hands-on. And so as fathers, again, we want to recognize the important role that they play. Because to be honest with you today, and again, this is probably a whole other lecture for another time, but with the rise of feminism and what we see, Western feminism, right? Not Islamically based feminism, but the rise of Western feminism where so many of our young women are growing up saying, I don't need a man in my life. We are also seeing a culture of masculinity that has been demoralized, and in many ways, it's created a very toxic gender inequality in our communities and in our homes. And again, different conversation, but important topic. If you guys are not familiar with Andrew Tate, I would definitely say take a look at this influential YouTuber guy who recently announced his conversion to Islam. But he supports what, in many ways, when you see Muslim women commenting on his posts even, what would be classified as a toxic masculine culture, right? This idea that males are better than females, males dominate, Unfortunately, from a cultural perspective, we're all sorts of confused, right? And we will choose to follow the sunnah in certain ways, but when it comes to our households, many times we're not following the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So to be more specific, how do we get our fathers more involved? Bring them to these lectures, bring them to the monthly parenting lectures, and reiterate the important role of the father. Read together the seerah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In particularly the key moments, where we see the connection between the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Fatima radiallahu anha. Develop dialogue where maybe it's you and the children, but also know, like, when you say how can fathers spend more time with children playing games and homework, imagine if you as the mother, and this is why partnership is so important in these households, right? You as the mother, right? You say, hey, I'm actually not gonna wash the dishes right now. I wanna play a game. Let's do a family game night where both father, mother, and children are involved. Or let's say the father is kind of hanging out on the couch watching TV, right? If you call the children and say, you know what, let's put the homework aside for a little bit and let's, sit together for 30 minutes and maybe watch something that's beneficial, watch something on National Geographic and marvel at the beauty that Allah Azza wa Jal has created in this earth. Sometimes we're so keen on the sense of well, I do everything and you do nothing, that we forget the idea of maybe it's okay sometimes to do nothing together, right? Maybe it's okay to model for our children this sense of okay, Baba comes home from work tired, and I'm also tired after a long day of being in the house and helping you guys and dropping off. Why don't we all sit down and watch an episode together? Why don't we all sit down and play a game? We often say in marriage talks that when you find the fault in someone else and you point the finger at them, you're forgetting to see the 3 fingers that are pointing back at you. So as much as it may hurt and it may feel like the father isn't doing their part, ask yourself, well, what can I do? And what can I do does not mean wash more dishes, cook more meals, or drive to more activities. Maybe it means that the kids have too many activities. Maybe you do need to cut back on the activities a little bit. Maybe it means, having dad come with you. Say, hey, I'm gonna drive the kids, but why don't you come with me for a drive? And we could stop for a cup of coffee afterwards, right? We live lives that are so structured and so busy that we lose sight often of what's most important. So there's a lot more of advice on this, but I do know it's a little bit past 1, and I don't want to take up more time than what was dedicated for this. So I will wrap up here. Jazakumullahu khair for being here. I do have, like I said, our cornerstone information here. I have some of my books here. You're welcome to email our office. My personal email is on my cards as well. You're welcome to email me directly if you have a question I didn't answer. I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal protects all of our children. I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal protects our ummah and protects the generations to come. I pray that Allah Azza wa Jal allows us to be the best parents that we can be, serving Him, pleasing Him, and raising our children for the sake of Him and Him alone. Jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suzy. This was very, very enlightening. Thank you so much. We have next coming up, please. Next month is going to be by Brother Yusuf Jabir on January 15th, Sunday. Same time, same place. And oh, by the way, next week we do have Dr. Suzy coming up for youth. It's going to be the same time for youth, ages 12 to 18 for youth, by same Dr. Suzy Ismail next week for youth. So please try and have your kids come, ages from 12 to 18 next week, please, same time. And we are going to send out a survey for you guys to give us any topics, relevant topics that you think we should have a speaker to talk about and address. We'll love to have a survey done for you guys. Thank you.